you take a look at this, and this is, 10 meters long, neck, and loosely linked. This is sort of goes out there. It's the length of this room, just hanging out there. And you go to museums and you see them hanging from wires or steel rods through them. But how did these things hang up in the air in the first place? These are huge, mechanically impossible structures to be out there. And you need to try and understand the mechanics. Well, I was an orthopedic surgeon, and I was limiting my practice to back pain. And in the mid-1970s, I said, I need to understand the spine mechanics more. What they gave me to understand it, the lever systems that you learn about, just didn't make sense to me while I was doing spine mechanics. The model that's being used now, and this is brand new, I just got this off in a journal, they're comparing the mechanics of the dinosaur to an ostrich neck, which is the closest thing they can get to this thing. They say, and this is 2007, it's brand new, and they talk about the mechanics of the neck. And when you look at this thing, you see that it can easily curve. These are flexible, and if you know a dead chicken, it just flops over. You see, and it goes in any direction you want. And the cross sections here are really hardly any muscle mass posteriorly to hold that thing up in the air. In fact, it's in the same plane as the joints, essentially. So it's hardly, there's no way of holding that thing up. You can see here that the muscles just run right close to the joints. Mechanically very inefficient. At the end of the mall is the Washington Monument, which is 555 foot tall and 30 foot thick at the base and 5 foot thick at the top, and it's just stand there rigid, classic column. And this is the model for the spine, essentially. Well, you sit there and you're thinking, and how does this work? Well, also in Washington, like every place else, they're building, and you have these nice cranes going out there, and you say, oh, maybe this is a model. I can get this neck sticking out there in this crane model. Well, but then you have to realize that they got that thing sticking up and those wires coming out there, and you would have to have a spinous process going up, all the way up as, the CN Tower in order to hold up the neck of the dinosaur. So I said, there got to be another way. Well, serendipitously, right across the mall is a Hirshhorn Museum. And the Hirshhorn Museum is the Museum of Modern Art there, and it's this beautiful place. It has a rotunda, and outside in front it has this courtyard full of all these interesting pieces of sculpture. And right there, and you can't see it because it's almost invisible, but right there is Snelson's tower, called the Needle Tower. And you have to get there in a hurry because I think in 2 years they're moving it to the campus of George Mason University in front of the new engineering department. They put up an engineering building, and this is going to be on loan from the Hirshhorn. But you could see this structure sitting there, and my wife took that picture of me, by the way, and you could just see these pipes floating up in space, not touching one another, just hanging suspended in the air. And you say, how is this possible? And then you realize that you can tilt it, you see. And if you look at Snelson's other works, you'll see something here like he called, this is the dragon. And this goes about 45 feet off in the air, cantilevered off that way. And he called these, well, he didn't call them, he called these floating compression. Buckminster Fuller, who you remember from the geodesic dome, called these tensegrity structures for tension integrity. There's an integration of all the tension structure. And this is a couple more. The one in the bottom right is actually in front of the National Institute of Medicine in Washington, D.C. We have another one in Baltimore. His sculptures are all over the world. The one on the left is in the Netherlands. And the cantilever is about 30 feet over the water like that. Seemingly impossible because it's held at its base by nothing. A couple of anchor bolts. That's about it. Well, this thing gave me an idea. I said, look, this is another one of his great big sculptures, and you can see from the little boy here, it's hard to see, riding a bicycle. This is huge. a huge piece. I said, my God, this is it. This is what I can build my dinosaur out of. And it was the aha. You see, this was it. It was my Gestalt moment. I knew it right then and there. Unfortunately, I was not the first to think about this. What we're talking about is that the mechanics of the cell and the mechanics of multiple cells and the mechanics of the fly and the mechanics of the giraffe also have to link together mechanically, because we're building from the one cell. And we're building our way up, and we're building autogeny recapitulates phylogeny, or is it the other way around? I never remember. But when we're talking about a hierarchical system, we build from the bottom up and work your way all the way up to the top. There's a structural continuum. At each stage of building, it has to be a whole structure. You don't have superficial scaffolding. You know, when they build buildings, you see all the scaffolding up that they put up and then they take down later, you know, because otherwise it would fall down while they were building it. This thing has to be structurally stable at every stage of its building. It has to be stable with flexible joints. We are held together by spit, snot. You know, surface tension is what holds us together, what holds each cell next to the cell. There is no rigid link of anything in the body. We build rigid things, but all the joints together are flexible. It has to be omnidirectional. All biologic structures can work right side up, upside down, in space, water. Doesn't make any difference. From the structural standpoint, the structure is intact no matter where you build it. This building is unidirectional. If you turn it on the side, it'll all fall apart. Most things built by man are unidirectional. If you build airplanes, you got to build them omnidirectional in a sense. But you can't, you have to recognize that there's a directional component to it. It has to be energy efficient. If there's anything that defines life, it's efficient energy. This is the Journal of Biomechanics. This is the cover. They haven't changed the cover in God knows how many years. And you see these little cubes of things that they build with. But when you look inside the articles, inside, none of them build with cubes anymore. They all use these triangulated things, and they're making these triangles and things in their design. They can do that now with computers, which they had a real problem doing with before they had computers. And what these guys are doing, building trusses. Good trusses are triangulated structure, and let me just go through that a little bit for you. The square versus the triangle. Now, you build a square frame structure, and it has to be stuck together because what happens is there's torque and twisting at all the joints. So and you get this twisting motion, and it pulls it apart. Okay? And in fact, any frame structure that is not triangulated is inherently unstable. You all know this when you build things. Anybody who builds a door or a picture or anything, or a bookcase, until you get that diagonal in there, the thing is unstable, it's going to be shaking all over the place. They'll collapse of their own weight. But if you look at a truss system, it's different. You load a truss, and some of the members are in pure compression. They're just taking compression loads, and the other ones are in tension. And you can replace that bottom bar with a wire, and it'll work just as well. The joints are pin joints. They're completely mobile. They don't take any stresses, torque or bending moments at all. This is planar trusses, as you see, like bridges that you see. And this is a tetrahedron, which is a three-dimensional truss system, which is what we have here. And you see you load at the top, and the loading is compression around the uprights, and then in the bottom it's all in tension. Now these are unidirectional, because if I turn this thing upside down, which I have to do my next slide thing, you can tell that you'd have to change other things. If you made these bottom ones wires, it wouldn't work. You'd have to make them rigid because they would then be under compression. So it's a unidirectional structure. But common sense tells us, and the rules of logic, which are mathematical rules, you see, if you have a flexible joint and can stand up, you are a truss, which means biologically we are trusses. We have to be, because otherwise we couldn't stand up. And it's been shown by Vesmajian, a Canadian, who showed that when you're standing, your EMG is essentially silent. You have no electrical impulses that you can read on an EMG. Okay, we're back to where we were because Darcy Thompson recognized this when he looked at his bridge, and he says, we're missing something. We're seeing the thick lines of the bones, but we're missing the thin lines of the muscles and ligaments. And he recognized this, but he couldn't go beyond that because he didn't have another model for it. But he did a lot of work on it, and if anyone wants to read a nice little book, it's on growth and form. It is the essence of biology. Let's go into trusses again. This is a three-dimensional thing, so let's talk about trusses. There are only 3 fully triangulated symmetrical trusses. And symmetry is part of biologic systems, which I won't go into today. But we have the tetrahedron, the octahedron with 8 sides, and then we have the icosahedron, 20 sides. All right? 30 edges, 12 vertices. And there's a mathematical formula for that. You can figure it all out. But this is an exoskeletal structure with the shell on the outside, right? Like a crab or a lobster or something. You can internalize those structures. So the compression elements are within the structure going from vertex to vertex, but not crossing the center and not touching one another. And the outer shell is in tension. And you get a tensegrity icosahedron. With none of the compression elements touching one another, the outer shell in tension. Okay. This is tension integrity. Again, it's Buckminster's fullest term. We'll call it the tensegrity icosahedron, and an endoskeletal structure like we are. This is a truly omnidirectional structure. Once you build this thing like this, it stays like this. So you can turn any direction and press on it, and what's in tension stays in tension, what's in compression stays in compression. The compression elements are floating compression within the structure itself. It's an organized pattern that's not haphazard by any means, and it's also self-generating. We'll get into that a little bit. So you can build columns like this with it, and actually you have to realize that these are stacked icosahedrons that you're doing when you build a column like that. And if you stack 2 of them, they interlock with one another. Unfortunately, this broke a little bit in traveling. That's what happens. But they interlock one another. When they interlock with one another, they do it in a helix, and they do it into a double helix. Isn't that interesting? Just structurally, that's the way they fit. And you put a third one, you get a triple helix, which looks like this by one of my friends, Bob Burkhardt, who is I don't know how he does all these things. They do all these computer modeling of these things. And what you have is collagen, and of course bone, without the minerals in it, is soft. You can bend it, twist it, tie it into knots. It still keeps its shape. What you do is you add hydroxyapatite, which now you recognize is it itself an icosahedron. Hydroxyapatite is the salt that stiffens the bone. You see, and you put it together, and there's a Fleming's model of a bone that's too fragile for me to carry around with them. But you can see how this all evolves from one point to another. Here's the Epcot Center. The interesting thing about these guys standing on the Epcot Center is that the Epcot Center doesn't squish down like ordinary things do, ordinary buildings. When I stand here directly under my feet, the floor of this building deforms exactly equal to my body weight. Right there, and not an inch away. But right there, that floor is deforming underneath me. Structure using a linear pump, if you're squirting out things out of it. As the contents drop down, the pressure goes down. And as it squeezes down, the pressure goes down. Okay. In a nonlinear pump, as you squeeze down, the pressure goes up. As shown here. Okay? Now, you're familiar with that in things like soccer balls, because when you kick a soccer ball, it doesn't just dent in the side, the whole ball shrinks down, because it's a truncated icosahedron, as you now recognize. Okay? The whole ball shrinks down and then explodes out, and that's why they go so far. because they're compressed and then boom, all that energy explodes out, okay? And they're now making icosahedral golf balls that are supposed to do the same thing, and they talk about them, and they don't really explain why it works and goes further, but that's why, all right? What do you people recognize as nonlinear pumps in biologic systems? Well, there's a whole slew of them. In fact, all the pumping things in the body are nonlinear pumps. You couldn't empty out the blood out of your heart, the air out of your lungs, the urine out of your bladder, the baby out of your uterus, if it wasn't a nonlinear pump, where it increases. So that last push to get that baby out is stronger than the first push to get it out because of this nonlinearity. The wall of the uterus doesn't get thinner as the baby expands. The bladder wall doesn't get thinner as the bladder expands. The heart muscle doesn't get thinner as the bladder expands because that's not the way nonlinear structures work. But as you know, in a balloon, the walls would get thinner. And even in a metal drum that was pushed on, the walls are actually getting thinner. You just don't see it as such. Well, I just want to show you a bunch of these in nature. I just got the Bluetongue virus recently, but they're all over the place. You know, if you start, you'll now see this every place. This is Volvox, which is a freshwater organism, clearly an icosahedron. And I was giving this talk with some other person, and we both showed the same slide of the same thing. He for energy medicine, Oshman was showing this for energy medicine, and I was showing it as an icosahedral structure. Okay? But common pollen is that the dandelion was the first really big structure I saw. And I'll tell you the story of the dandelion. I was walking my little dog, Daisy, at the time. Daisy's died too. Everybody's died. But I was walking this little dog, Daisy, you know, and I'm thinking about these icosahedrons, and Daisy does her thing and squats down and does her thing, and right there's the dandelion. I said, Eureka, there it is. I recognize that I have my my large size icosahedron. Here's a pufferfish. I have one of those sitting on my desk. They're all over the place. Now you'll recognize these structures every place because you know what to look for. Because now we have a structural model that seems to work. And not only that, but you can see that I can make a wheel out of this thing and bend it in any direction, and it works perfectly well. Okay. So here we have my flying swan. Okay. And if I use that as a model for the structure, I can incorporate it into the structure. Now, how do I get this neck to move? Well, it's easy. All you can do is just change the shape of one of the wires, or actually change the angle in one of the bones, and you can get that to flip back and forth. And this is the perfect model for cruciate ligaments of the knee. But I'll tell you, all the other joints work that way, and it doesn't require much in the way of muscle forces. It requires changing angles. And this is the first model that we had that we can actually bend and twist and show this with, which is remarkable. But this is internally vectored by just some control things within it, and none of the compression elements touch on any compression elements. There are no hinges in the classic sense of the term. There are no levers in that structure. And these are some of the mechanotransduction diseases that Ingberg talks about at the cellular level, and such things as mad cow disease and many others. Actually, the person who's getting to that closest now is George and his work. So the methods of treating most of these dynamical diseases is by dynamical treatment. You shove them, you poke them, you twist them, you can stick needles in them with a variety of things, but you're trying to make a sudden change in the phenomena and change this whatever mechanical system that's going on. And of course, George now has this system that sort of that goes both. That seems to be doing both now. So he's moved it into a whole new system, and still we're learning a lot about this now.